Right now, a storm system that refuses to quit is loading up for another violent weekend. Millions of people across the middle of the country are bracing for flash floods and tornadoes, and at the same time, something almost unheard of is unfolding out in the Pacific. A storm is closing in on Hawaii that could rewrite more than 30 years of history in a single night. There's a lot to get through. So let's not waste a second, because the same weather pattern that's been battering the Midwest all week isn't loosening its grip. It's about to shift the danger onto brand new territory, and the people in its path have no idea yet how active things are going to get. Let's walk through all of it piece by piece, starting with the part of the country that's already been living under one severe weather threat after another. Begin with Friday, because this is where the story is actively happening. The Storm Prediction Center has drawn a slight risk of severe weather across Iowa, Missouri, and you probably saw this coming, Illinois. Here's the detail that should stop you. This is roughly the 5th or 6th day in a row these same communities have found themselves under a slight risk or higher. Think about what that means for the ground beneath them, because it matters enormously for what comes next. Wrapping around that core zone is a marginal severe threat that stretches all the way from Denver, Colorado, eastward into Virginia. Along that entire corridor, the primary concern is damaging wind gusts. Expect not just one round of storms, but likely 2 or 3 separate lines rolling through, the exact same rhythm this region has endured for days now. Large hail is on the table too, mostly, near Denver and possibly around Iowa and Missouri. And there's a low but real tornado threat sliding into the afternoon, focused on places like Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, and Davenport. If you live anywhere in that zone, this is your reminder to make sure you have more than one way to get a warning the moment it's issued, because these storms don't send a polite invitation. Now hold that thought, because Saturday isn't a break. It's an escalation, and the geography of the danger is about to move. The Storm Prediction Center has carved out 2 separate slight risks for severe storms. One sits over Denver, Nebraska, and the western reaches of Kansas. The other stretches from southern Michigan and Indiana all the way down into South Carolina. Connecting the two is a sprawling marginal threat that ties nearly the whole eastern half of the map together. The headline, Danger for Saturday, is damaging wind, with gusts potentially reaching between 60 and 75 miles per hour, the kind of wind that snaps limbs, downs power lines, and turns loose objects into projectiles. Large hail sneaks back into the high plains again, and there's a genuine risk of a couple of tornadoes, most likely near Kalamazoo, South Bend, Fort Wayne, and Columbus. That's a lot of populated territory sitting under the crosshairs, which is exactly why redundancy in how you receive warnings isn't paranoia, it's common sense. Let's slow down and actually time this out, because knowing severe weather is coming is one thing, but knowing when it's arriving on your doorstep is what keeps you safe. As of this morning, rain is falling across nearly the entire Midwest. Storms are lined up like train cars from Des Moines back toward Cincinnati, with a batch of thunderstorms pushing through Indianapolis and St. Louis, each one, capable of an isolated, damaging wind gust. Most of these morning storms are expected to fade around lunchtime, and that's the moment people tend to let their guard down, which is precisely the wrong instinct. Because in the late afternoon, somewhere around 5 or 6 p.m., the atmosphere is forecast to reload. An isolated supercell or two could fire up north of Kansas City, and those are the storms that carry both an isolated tornado threat and a hail threat. Fairly quickly, though, that activity is expected to congeal into a line of thunderstorms, and once it does, damaging wind becomes the dominant danger, especially for anyone near Trenton, Kirksville, and the surrounding area. Follow that line through the night, and you can trace exactly where the threat travels. By 9 or 10 in the evening, it's expected to be pushing toward Quincy, Burlington, and even Davenport, still capable of spitting out an isolated tornado and scattered damaging gusts. It keeps going into the early overnight hours toward Peoria before it's expected to finally weaken as it approaches Chicago. Meanwhile, don't forget the other half of the country. Back in the Central Plains, it's shaping up to be a busy afternoon of its own. Storms are forecast to ignite right along the Rocky Mountains, and then roll eastward through Denver, Sterling, and Lamar in the late afternoon and evening, packing damaging winds up to 75 miles per hour in isolated pockets of quarter-sized hail. 2 very different regions, one relentless pattern, and the weekend is only getting started. Here's where the forecast gets genuinely tricky, and I want to be honest with you about the uncertainty, because that honesty is the whole point. As we head into Saturday, another round of thunderstorms is expected to develop across the Ohio Valley, and forecasters are openly split on how it evolves. There's a scenario where this becomes a more robust tornado risk across Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. There's an equally real scenario where it never organizes at all, where it amounts to nothing more than a weak leftover swirl of energy from Friday's storms drifting through with little punch. These particular setups are some of the hardest in all of meteorology to nail down, and anyone who tells you they know exactly how it'll play out is guessing. What the high resolution guidance is showing right now is a small area of spin developing near Fort Wayne and Toledo in the afternoon, with a few rotating supercells possible across Ohio into the late afternoon and early evening. That's why some of the significant tornado parameters in that zone are ticking upward into a range that would be more than enough to support at least a couple of tornadoes, possibly even one near Cincinnati. But, and this is important, not every model agrees. Other guidance places these storms differently, with some suggesting rotation could begin as early as 4 or 5 in the afternoon across northwest Ohio before expanding through the late evening and overnight. When the models disagree on both the timing and the location, that's the atmosphere's way of telling you the answer isn't locked in yet. What does look increasingly likely is that a tornado threat of some kind exists across Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and perhaps northern Kentucky. This is one of those situations that demands close watching rather than firm promises. Let's carry the story into Sunday, because the pattern isn't done shifting the danger eastward. Another round of severe weather is expected, and while its intensity is still uncertain, the zone to watch is sliding toward Washington, D.C., Virginia, and even West Virginia. A corridor is expected to set up from southern Pennsylvania down toward Virginia Beach, and any supercells that manage to develop there will be capable of rotating and producing an isolated tornado or two alongside damaging wind and large hail. So if you've got outdoor plans anywhere in the mid-Atlantic, particularly from the middle of the afternoon into the early evening, keep one across Delaware, Maryland, and eastern Virginia. Farther west, back across the Midwest and Ohio Valley, a few thunderstorms remain possible on Sunday. But the wind shear that fuels rotation looks considerably weaker there, so the tornado concern is much lower. Maybe an isolated wind or hail report, perhaps a brief spin-up, but nothing like the more organized threat further east. And up in New England, a passing low-pressure system looks set to deliver a soaking of rain from Sunday into early Monday. But if I had to point to the single most dangerous element of this entire setup, it isn't the wind, and it isn't even the tornadoes, it's the water. The Weather Prediction Center has issued a moderate risk of excessive rainfall for the Des Moines and Davenport area, and you need to understand what that label actually means. A moderate risk is the second highest level on their entire scale, a level 3 out of 4. Forecasters do not reach for that language casually. It's a flashing signal that a serious, potentially life-threatening flooding event is on the table. We're likely looking at several inches of rain across that region, with isolated spots capable of picking up anywhere from 6 to 12 inches in a single day. And remember what I told you earlier about the ground already being pounded by days of storms? That's the piece that turns heavy rain into a disaster. Saturated soil can't absorb another downpour. It has nowhere left to put the water. So the water rises, and it rises fast. The flooding threat doesn't stop there. A slight risk of excessive rainfall stretches from Omaha back toward Roanoke, Virginia, with additional slight risks scattered around Denver and even out toward Arizona and Utah, and a sprawling marginal threat blanketing nearly everyone else. But make no mistake, the bullseye remains where it's been for days, the Ohio Valley and the Midwest. This region has already endured multiple flash flood emergencies, which is the most urgent flood alert that exists. And the single most important thing I can tell you is painfully simple. If you come to a flooded road, turn around, don't drive through it. It takes shockingly little moving water to sweep a vehicle away, and more people die in cars during floods than almost any other way. Turn around, don't drown. That phrase exists because people keep ignoring it, and it keeps costing lives. Look ahead over the next 48 hours, and the rainfall totals become genuinely alarming. High-resolution guidance dumps an enormous amount of rain north of Champaign and over toward Indianapolis, with localized zones potentially seeing 6 to 10 inches that could very well become the epicenter of the flooding. But once again, the models argue with each other. Other guidance shifts the heaviest rain much farther west, centered west of Peoria, though even around Peoria itself, 2 to 7 inches remains possible, with similar totals north of Indianapolis. When you line up every available model, you get a spread of very different scenarios, but the through line, the thing nearly all of them agree on, is that the highest totals are most likely to fall somewhere near Davenport and Lafayette. That's your zone of greatest concern, and if you're anywhere near it, treat every heavy downpour this weekend as a potential emergency rather than an inconvenience. Now, before we look at the long-range picture across the mainland, we have to travel roughly 2,500 miles out into the Pacific, because what's happening near Hawaii right now is the kind of event that stops meteorologists in their tracks. This is Tropical Storm Lala. As of the latest advisories, it's carrying maximum sustained winds around 60 miles per hour. But the number that matters isn't its current strength, it's its trajectory. Lala is forecast to strengthen and become a hurricane as it approaches the big island of Hawaii, and a hurricane warning is already in effect for Hawaii County. Sit with the weight of that for a moment. The last time a hurricane actually made landfall in the state of Hawaii was in 1992. That's more than 3 decades ago. An entire generation has grown up on those islands, never once experiencing a direct hurricane strike, because the waters and winds surrounding Hawaii almost always tear, approaching storms apart before they can arrive. Lala is threatening to break a streak that has held for over 30 years, and it's doing it right now. Here's the timeline forecasters are watching. The outer bands of Lala are expected to reach the Big Island early Saturday morning, brushing areas like Hilo and Hawaiian Ocean. View first. Through the afternoon, the storm is projected to make an extremely close approach and possibly a landfall over the southern part of the island near Pahala. Then, into the late evening and overnight, it's expected to skirt back offshore while clipping essentially the entire island chain on its way past. Even the guidance that keeps the center offshore only nudges it out by roughly 15 to 25 miles, which is close enough that it hardly matters, because whether or not that center technically touches land, the eastern side of the Big Island is still in line for damaging winds and dangerous storm surge either way. That's the crucial thing to understand about a storm like this. The exact landfall point is almost a technicality when the impacts spread far beyond the center. And those impacts are serious. Rainfall totals of 8 to 12 inches are forecast across Maui and the Big Island, with isolated maximums reaching an astonishing 25 inches on the Big Island. 25 inches, more than 2 feet of water from the sky, falling onto some of the steepest volcanic terrain on Earth. On slopes like that, water doesn't pool gently. It races downhill, gathering speed and debris, triggering flash floods and mudslides that can bury a road or a home in moments. Storm surge is expected to push coastal water levels up, and peak sustained winds could climb as high as 70 miles per hour in exposed areas, particularly around Highway 11 on the southern side of the island. There's an extra danger hidden in that wind figure too. On Hawaii's ridges and mountainsides, winds routinely run up to 30% stronger than the surface values in a forecast, so those elevated communities could be hit even harder than the numbers suggest. You might reasonably wonder why the Pacific is suddenly spawning intense tropical systems aimed at Hawaii when the mainland's been the story all summer. Part of the answer is the ocean itself. The waters in this part of the Pacific are running unusually warm, and warm water is the fuel tropical systems feed on. A storm that would normally starve and collapse in cooler seas can instead hold its strength or even intensify all the way to the islands. That's the difference between the streak holding and the streak breaking. And this weekend, the conditions are tilting in the storm's favor, which raises a sobering point worth sitting with. For 34 years, Hawaii's protection was never a permanent shield. It was a favorable roll of the dice, repeated over and over, and dice don't come with guarantees. Now let's swing back across to the Atlantic, because the tropical story has a second chapter there, and it's moving in a very different direction. Just a day earlier, forecasters were tracking a system with strong development odds, the kind of angry red and orange blob that gets everyone's attention. But the Atlantic has since downgraded its enthusiasm. That feature sitting east of the Lesser Antilles has faded to a much lower chance of formation, somewhere around 30%, and the reason is wind shear. Strong upper-level winds are tearing at the system, preventing it from organizing, effectively smearing it apart before it can get going. It's a reminder that not every disturbance becomes a monster. Sometimes the atmosphere itself does the job of shutting one down. The more interesting candidate is the tropical wave following behind it, which has a somewhat better shot at developing into a tropical storm. If it does, it would earn the next name on the Atlantic list, Dolly. As for where these features are headed, the first, weaker one looks likely to drift more toward South America, while the second is expected to track closer to the Lesser Antilles, and from there its future path is genuinely wide open. It really could go almost anywhere, which is exactly why this is a watch and update situation rather than a forecast you can bank on today. It's worth taking a second to explain why a storm like Lala is such a rare visitor to Hawaii in the first place, because understanding the why makes it clearer just how unusual this weekend actually is. Storms approaching the islands from the east typically run into a wall of factors working against them: cooler water upstream of the islands, persistent wind shear generated by the trade wind flow, and dry, stable air wrapped around the subtropical ridge that normally sits over the region. Any one of those factors can be enough to gut a tropical system before it gets close, and usually it's a combination of all three, which is exactly why direct hurricane strikes on Hawaii are so historically rare compared to, say, the Gulf Coast or the Southeast, places that sit in the open path of the Atlantic's warm water highway. When forecasters talk about Hawaii's protective moat, that's what they mean: an unusually hostile stretch of ocean and atmosphere that storms have to survive to reach the islands intact. What's different this time is the water. Sea surface temperatures in the storm's path are running well above what's typical for this time of year, and that warmth is doing exactly what warm water always does for a tropical system, providing fuel faster than the usual hostile environment can strip it away. That's the entire ballgame with Lala. It isn't that the atmosphere around Hawaii suddenly became friendly to hurricanes. It's that the ocean got warm enough to let the storm survive the trip anyway. Let's zoom back out to the mainland and look at what happens once this brutal weekend finally winds down, because unfortunately the pattern doesn't just switch off. The weather across the United States is expected to stay fairly active. The tricky part is pinning down exactly where the next round of severe storm sets up, but the northern plains and the Midwest look most likely to stay in the game around Monday and Tuesday, as yet another storm system makes a close pass. That system could touch off another line of thunderstorms across Illinois, Indiana, and even Ohio by Tuesday and Wednesday. Beyond that, the uncertainty grows quickly as we push toward the end of August, and honestly, that far out, confidence drops off sharply. But here's a thought to hold on to through all of this relentless heat and severe weather. We are genuinely not far from the turn of the seasons. Fall is only about a month away. If you've been longing for cooler air and quieter skies, relief is closer than it feels in the middle of a week like this one. That's a small comfort, but sometimes a small comfort is exactly what gets you through a rough stretch. Let me pull all of this together, because when you step back, the shape of the story becomes clear. A single stubborn weather pattern is doing three enormous things at once. It's firing off day after day of severe thunderstorms along the edge of a sprawling heat dome, threatening damaging winds, hail, and isolated tornadoes from the high plains to the mid-Atlantic. It's dumping torrential rain onto ground that's already saturated, driving a moderate level 3 out of 4 flash flood risk across parts of Iowa and Illinois in a region that's already declared multiple flood emergencies. And thousands of miles away, it's part of a broader, restless atmosphere that's allowing a rare and dangerous tropical system to close in on Hawaii, threatening to end a 34-year streak in a single weekend. That's the whole reason this forecast keeps coming back to a storm that shifted, and to millions of people now finding themselves in its path. Because the danger genuinely is moving day by day, from the plains into the Ohio Valley, toward the mid-Atlantic, and out across the Pacific. And the people newly in its way are the ones who most need to be paying attention right now. If there's one message I want you to carry out of this, it's that none of these threats deserve to be shrugged off. Not the flooding, because water is the quiet killer that takes more lives than the wind ever does. Not the tornado risk across the Ohio Valley, uncertain as it is, because uncertainty is precisely why you prepare rather than wait. And certainly not because a streak of good fortune is not the same thing as safety, and Hawaii is about to be reminded of that in the hardest way. The forecasters who fly aircraft into these storms, who run these models, who issue these warnings, are not crying wolf. They're giving you time. And what you do with that time is what determines how this weekend ends for you and the people you love. Here's what that looks like in practice. Have more than one way to receive a warning. A phone alert, a weather radio, a local news app, so a single point of failure doesn't leave you in the dark overnight, which is exactly when some of these storms are expected to fire. Keep your supplies ready, water, a charged battery pack, flashlights, and basic first aid, so you're not scrambling for them the moment the sky turns green. If you're anywhere in or near the moderate flood risk zone around Des Moines and Davenport, know your evacuation route before you need it, and don't wait until water is already in the street to figure out where you're going. If you're on the big island of Hawaii, take Lala seriously even though the exact landfall point is still uncertain, because as we've covered, the impacts spread far wider than the center of the storm ever does. Secure loose outdoor items, know where you'd shelter from high wind, and pay attention to any evacuation guidance issued by Hawaii County Emergency Management. And no matter where you are this weekend, when you see water over a road, turn around every single time, no exceptions. This weekend is going to be long and loud across a huge chunk of the country, and the situation near Hawaii could change hour by hour. The most useful thing you can do is stay informed rather than surprised. Keep watching the Storm Prediction Center's outlooks as they update. Keep an eye on the Weather Prediction Center's flood risk maps, and keep tracking the National Hurricane Center's advisories on Lala as they come in, because forecasts like this one shift, sometimes significantly, with each new model run. What's true right now, at this moment, is that a huge stretch of the country from the high plains to the mid-Atlantic is looking at multiple days of severe thunderstorm and flash flood risk layered directly on top of ground that's already saturated from a week of relentless storms. And that, at the same time, a genuinely rare tropical threat is bearing down on a state that hasn't seen a direct hurricane strike in over 3 decades. Both of those stories are unfolding at once, thousands of miles apart, and both of them deserve your full attention this weekend. Stay weather aware, look out for your neighbors, and keep checking back as the picture sharpens over the next 48 hours.